They thought he was just a janitor, until they found out the truth. And by then, it was way too late. Today, we're diving into a shocking story of power, justice, and karma hitting back hard. Stick around, because this one's going to leave you speechless. The invisible man in the company, the elevator doors slid open, and he stepped out, a mop in one hand, a bucket in the other. His reflection stared back at him from the sleek glass walls of the corporate headquarters. This was his company, his empire. And yet, no one in this building knew who he was. Not yet. Ethan Cole had spent years climbing the ranks, proving himself in an industry that dismissed outsiders. Now, as the newly appointed CEO of Lexington and Hayes Marketing, he was stepping into his own company for the first time. But instead of wearing a tailored suit, he walked in dressed as a janitor. Faded work pants, scuffed sneakers, and a name tag that read Ben, just another worker in the background. This wasn't a gimmick. It was an investigation. Ethan had heard disturbing rumors, an arrogant, toxic workplace culture where employees disrespected those they saw as beneath them. He needed to see it for himself, not from the executive suite, but from the lowest level possible. The lobby was pristine, with marble floors and minimalist decor. The scent of espresso lingered from the in-house cafe. At the front desk, a receptionist scrolled through her phone, barely acknowledging him. "Custodial office is in the basement," she muttered, waving him away without looking. He thanked her. She didn't respond. Pushing his mop bucket down the hall, Ethan observed everything. Employees rushed past, talking about campaigns, meetings, weekend plans. No one made eye contact. No one saw him. He was invisible, until he wasn't. Two junior executives, Logan Wright and Jason Miller, stood near the break room, laughing. As Ethan passed by, he caught a snippet of their conversation. "Can't believe HR keeps hiring guys like that," Logan scoffed. "Corporate needs to meet their diversity quotas, I guess." Jason chuckled. "Yeah, I bet he barely speaks English." Ethan gripped the mop handle tighter, but kept moving. The real test was still ahead. ####. The first test of character. The third floor housed the marketing department, the company's creative core. Employees gathered near the conference room, sipping coffee, trading office gossip. As Ethan reached for a trash bin, someone stuck out a foot. The bucket jerked forward. Water sloshed onto the floor. Laughter erupted. "Watch it, man," said Blake Carter, a senior manager, dabbing at his expensive shoes. "My bad," Ethan said evenly, grabbing paper towels. Blake turned to the others, smirking. "I swear, they'll hire anyone these days." A woman in a fitted blazer, Olivia Torres, added with a chuckle, "Does he even speak English?" Ethan met her gaze. She didn't look away. He had seen enough. For the next few hours, he did more listening than cleaning. Every dismissive glance, every whispered insult, every condescending smirk. He memorized them all. But not everyone was cruel. Samantha Reed, a junior assistant, offered him a polite smile. Henry Collins, a veteran employee, actually thanked him when he emptied his trash. Small things, but they mattered. By noon, Ethan knew this company had a disease, and it was time to diagnose just how deep the rot went. ##### The cafeteria incident. Employees filed into the cafeteria on the 5th floor, a sleek, open-concept space with floor-to-ceiling windows. Ethan maneuvered through the crowd, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies, listening. He paused near a table where Logan, Jason, and Blake sat. Their conversation flowed freely until he got close. "Man, imagine working a job like that," Jason smirked. "No deadlines, no stress. Just mop and go." Blake leaned back, laughing. "Bet they don't even check resumes for those positions." The group chuckled as if Ethan wasn't standing right there. He wondered, would they still laugh if they knew who he really was? But they didn't, and that was their mistake. He turned to grab a tray off a nearby table when someone bumped into him, hard. He caught himself before the cart tipped over, but a few cleaning bottles tumbled onto the floor. "Oh, come on," a voice groaned. Ethan looked up to see Vanessa Sinclair, the VP of Marketing. Sharp suit, high heels, and the air of someone who made 6 figures and knew it. She glared at the scattered supplies like they had personally offended her. "Can you pick that up? Some of us don't have time for this mess." He crouched slowly, gathering the bottles. Melissa Cho, another executive, checked her phone, barely looking at him. "You know," she added, "if you actually cleaned instead of standing around, you wouldn't be in people's way." Ethan kept his voice steady. "Just doing my job." Melissa rolled her eyes and walked away. Not one person stepped in. Not one colleague called them out. The silence said everything. Then, something unexpected happened. While Ethan refilled a soap dispenser near the sinks, Samantha approached. She hesitated, then handed him a folded napkin. "Hey," she said softly. "Someone left this at my desk, but I think it's for you." Ethan opened it. Inside, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Not everyone here is like them. I see you. I respect you." His chest tightened. He looked up, but Samantha was already walking away. It was the first kindness he had received all day. But kindness wasn't enough to fix a company poisoned from the inside. Ethan had what he needed. Now, it was time to set his plan in motion. He walked out of the cafeteria, past the same people who had laughed at him just moments ago. This time, he smiled to himself. They had no idea what was coming next. Soon, they would. And when that moment arrived, no one would be laughing anymore. The wheels were already in motion. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning would bring a surprise that none of them saw coming. The very people who dismissed him would soon stand before him, no longer in control of their own fates. And for the first time, they would have to listen. Ethan took a deep breath as he stepped into the elevator. He was no longer just observing. Now he was preparing. His next move would decide the fate of this company and the people in it. The weight of his decision settled in his chest, but there was no turning back. Justice was coming. The reckoning was near. His time in disguise was over, and now it was their turn to face reality. The reckoning begins. Ethan sat alone in a dimly lit office, reviewing the employee files he had requested under the guise of a janitor needing HR documentation. Each report was a piece of the puzzle, a roadmap to the toxic environment he had witnessed firsthand. But he wasn't here just to observe anymore. It was time to act. He pressed the intercom. Send in Vanessa Sinclair, Melissa Cho, Blake Carter, Logan Wright, and Jason Miller. A few minutes later, the very people who had mocked and belittled him entered the office, oblivious to what was coming. They took their seats across from him, confused. Vanessa frowned. "Where's the CEO?" Ethan leaned back, folding his hands. "You're looking at him." The room fell into a stunned silence. Jason's face turned pale. Logan swallowed hard. Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I was undercover," Ethan continued. "I saw how you treated people. And now, it's time to deal with the consequences." The tension in the room thickened as Ethan pulled out a folder and flipped it open. Blake Carter, 3 formal complaints from junior employees for verbal abuse. Vanessa Sinclair, 2 reports of discriminatory hiring practices. Logan Wright, multiple complaints about fostering a hostile work environment. He let their names hang in the air, watching their reactions. Melissa opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan raised a hand. "Not a word. You had your turn. Now it's mine." He turned to Jason. "You like to joke about people who do honest work? Let's see how funny it is when you're doing community service after this company lets you go." Jason's eyes widened. "You're firing us?" Ethan smirked. "That's the first correct assumption you've made all week." Melissa scoffed. "You can't do this." Ethan leaned forward. "Oh, I can. And I just did." As security entered the room, ready to escort them out, he took one last look at the people who had made his employees' lives miserable. "You wanted to see what power looks like? Well, take a good look." He turned his attention back to the intercom. "Send in the next group." The reckoning had only just begun. Ethan watched as each of them was escorted out, their protests echoing down the hallway. The same arrogance they had flaunted minutes ago had vanished, replaced with the sharp sting of reality. He had more names on his list, and this was just the beginning. Over the next few hours, Ethan met with various department heads, listening to concerns that had long been ignored. He made it clear this was a new era. Those who thrived on fear and intimidation would no longer have a place at Lexington and Hayes. Employees who had been mistreated cautiously emerged from the shadows, realizing that, for the first time, they had a voice. HR initiated a full-scale evaluation of workplace policies, ensuring that favoritism and discrimination were eradicated. The IT department was assigned to conduct a full review of internal communications, flagging any patterns of misconduct. Complaints that had been previously dismissed without action were reopened. This wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about rebuilding the company from the ground up. By the next morning, whispers of the sudden firings had spread across the company. Some employees were relieved. Others were nervous. But one thing was certain. change was happening. Ethan called an emergency town hall meeting. Standing at the front of the vast conference room, he faced hundreds of employees, all waiting anxiously. I founded this company on principles of respect, hard work, and fairness, Ethan began. Yet somewhere along the way, that vision was lost. That ends today. He let the words settle before continuing. There will be changes, and those unwilling to be part of a culture built on mutual respect are free to leave. The room was silent. Then, slowly, applause broke out. Ethan exhaled, feeling the weight of his decision lift. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he was hopeful. The company he had built was finally becoming what it was meant to be. He took one last look at his employees. Some still looked skeptical, others uncertain. But at least now, they knew one thing for sure. The era of toxicity and unchecked power was over. And Ethan Cole wasn't backing down. That night, Ethan stayed late at the office, personally responding to emails from employees who finally felt safe enough to voice their concerns. The HR department was flooded with reports that had been buried for months, even years. As he shut his laptop, he realized this was more than just a company overhaul. It was a revolution. For too long, toxic leadership had dictated the culture, and now, for the first time, the power had shifted. He knew the battle wasn't over, but he had set the wheels in motion, and there was no turning back now. He stared out of his office window at the city skyline, knowing that the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow, new policies would be announced. A new standard of leadership would be put in place, and those who had abused their positions of power would be held accountable, one by one. This wasn't just about cleaning house. It was about setting an example for the entire industry. And Ethan was ready to lead the charge. As the lights in the office dimmed, Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had initiated a shift, but maintaining it would be the true challenge. The days ahead would determine whether Lexington and Hayes would truly change, or if old habits would claw their way back. But for now, at least, he had sent a message. The old ways were over, and a new era had begun. Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, watching as the city skyline glowed under the night sky. He had spent years building Lexington and Hayes into a powerhouse of innovation and success. But beneath the polished exterior, corruption had festered. Now, after the past 2 days of reckoning, the company was at a turning point. The morning arrived with an air of nervous anticipation. Employees whispered in hallways, speculating about what would happen next. The town hall meeting had made it clear that Ethan wasn't bluffing. This was the new era of Lexington and Hayes. Ethan entered the grand conference room where the department heads had gathered. Unlike the tense, fearful atmosphere of the previous day, there was a cautious optimism in the air. But some still doubted his commitment to change. He needed to show them. He took his seat at the head of the long oak table. Effective immediately, we are restructuring how leadership operates in this company. Those who led through intimidation, who abused their power, will have no place here. If you believe you cannot adjust to these changes, you are free to resign. A murmur rippled through the room. A few department heads exchanged glances, as if silently debating whether to fight or flee. One of them, Richard Vaughn, the VP of Sales, leaned forward. Ethan, we all want a fair work environment. But do you really think gutting leadership is the right way to do it? We have investors to answer to. Ethan locked eyes with him. I'm not gutting leadership, Richard. I'm ensuring it actually exists. A title doesn't make someone a leader. How they treat others does. If our investors care more about profits than the well-being of the people making them possible, then perhaps they aren't the right investors for this company. Silence. Then, slowly, Samantha Reed, now acting director of HR, nodded. I support this vision. Employees need to feel safe and valued here. Ethan exhaled. Good, because this is just the beginning. We are implementing new leadership training, anonymous employee feedback systems, and strict anti-discrimination policies. Promotions will be based on merit, not politics. And HR will have direct oversight to ensure accountability. One by one, the department heads nodded in agreement. Some were reluctant, but they understood. This was no longer the old Lexington and Hayes. The following week, a new challenge emerged. HR received an anonymous tip regarding an executive who had been involved in fraudulent activity, embezzlement hidden behind manipulated financial reports. If true, This could shake the company's foundation more than anything else. Ethan immediately launched an internal investigation. Working alongside legal advisors and forensic accountants, he began combing through financial records. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Someone had been siphoning company funds for years, and the evidence pointed to Gerald Hastings, the CFO. Ethan knew he couldn't act without undeniable proof, but if Hastings was guilty, this would be the biggest takedown yet. He had to be careful. The next few days would determine everything. Ethan enlisted a forensic audit team to dive even deeper into the financial records. Over the course of several late nights, they uncovered a paper trail leading to offshore accounts linked to shell companies Hastings had secretly established. The scheme had allowed him to drain millions from the company while covering his tracks with fake expenses. At the same time, Ethan brought in Samantha Reed to quietly interview employees who had worked under Hastings. The stories that emerged painted a grim picture: threats, manipulation, and bribes to keep people quiet. Some employees had suspected wrongdoing but feared retaliation if they spoke out. By the fourth day, Ethan had enough evidence to move forward. He called an emergency executive board meeting. Hastings entered the room, oblivious to what was about to unfold. "Gerald," Ethan began, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Care to explain these transactions?" Hastings barely glanced at the documents before scoffing. "This is ridiculous. You can't seriously think I had anything to do with this." Ethan leaned forward. "Then you won't mind explaining the offshore accounts we traced back to you? Or the falsified reports?" Hastings' confidence faltered. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, but found none. The board members were watching, waiting for his response. "This is a setup," Hastings said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're making a mistake." Ethan's expression remained calm, but his tone left no room for doubt. "The only mistake was thinking you wouldn't get caught." With that, security entered the room, ready to escort Hastings out of the building. His protests grew more desperate as reality set in. But there was no escaping the consequences now. As he was led away, Ethan turned to the board. "This company will no longer be a playground for corruption. Effective immediately, we will implement stronger financial oversight and compliance measures to ensure this never happens again." The meeting adjourned, but Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The fallout from Hastings' actions would take weeks to unravel, but for the first time, the company was headed toward true accountability. Ethan returned to his office, exhausted but resolute. Justice had been served, but he still had more work to do. That night, as he reviewed the final reports from the forensic team, a knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Samantha stepped in, a concerned look on her face. "Ethan," she said, setting a thick envelope on his desk. "We may have another problem." Ethan frowned, picking up the envelope and flipping it open. Inside was another set of financial reports, this time tied to a different executive. The numbers didn't lie. Someone else had been involved. Ethan clenched his jaw. Hastings wasn't working alone. Ethan sat at his desk, the dim glow of his computer screen reflecting off the polished wood. The file Samantha had given him was still open, its contents troubling. The numbers were clear. Hastings wasn't the only one involved. Someone else, maybe even multiple people, had been siphoning money from the company. And now, it was Ethan's job to find out who. Ethan gathered his most trusted team members in a private meeting early the next morning. Samantha, Chief Legal Officer David Morrison, and Head of Internal Security Nina Caldwell sat across from him, each with a copy of the financial records. "We've confirmed Hastings was running the embezzlement scheme, but these reports suggest that someone higher up may have been covering for him," Ethan said, tapping the documents on the table. "We need to track down every person who signed off on these transactions." David adjusted his glasses. "We'll need to cross-reference internal emails, approval logs, and offshore account transactions. If Hastings had an accomplice, they would have helped him process these funds without drawing attention." Samantha nodded. "I've already contacted our forensic accountants. They're combing through past audits for discrepancies. But if we're dealing with someone powerful, they may have covered their tracks well." Nina crossed her arms. "Then we'll find another way to expose them. People make mistakes when they think they're untouchable." Ethan leaned forward. "Good. We move quickly. If there's another player in this game, I want them gone before they can do any more damage." As investigations intensified, one name surfaced repeatedly: Michael Sterling, chairman of the board. Sterling had been a key decision-maker in major financial operations within Lexington and Hayes for over a decade. Hastings had worked directly under him for years, and their financial records showed multiple shared transactions. But there was no solid proof, only a pattern of suspicious activity. Ethan knew he needed to confront Sterling carefully. If the chairman was involved, exposing him would shake the company to its core. He decided to set a trap. Ethan arranged a private dinner with Sterling at an upscale restaurant. Over a quiet meal, he steered the conversation toward the company's recent shakeup. "Unfortunate what happened with Hastings," Ethan said, swirling his glass of wine. "He was a smart man, but greed got the better of him." Sterling nodded, feigning concern. "Yes, it's a shame, but these things happen in business, Ethan. Not everyone has the discipline to resist temptation." Ethan watched him closely. "True, but sometimes they don't act alone." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" Ethan leaned in slightly. "I'm suggesting that Hastings had a partner. Someone with influence. Someone who thought they were untouchable." For the briefest moment, Sterling's jaw tightened. It was subtle, but Ethan caught it. A crack in the facade. "If there was someone else involved," Ethan continued, "I'd find them, and I'd make sure they faced the same consequences." Sterling set his glass down and smirked. "Ethan, I admire your passion, but be careful where you aim it. You don't want to make enemies where you don't need to." Ethan held his gaze. "I don't mind making enemies, Michael. I mind letting corruption rot this company from the inside out." Sterling chuckled and leaned back. "Then I hope, for your sake, that you're looking in the right places." The conversation ended, but Ethan had his answer. Sterling was hiding something. Over the next few days, Ethan worked with his team to gather enough evidence to make a move. They traced hidden accounts, dug into confidential financial approvals, and even enlisted whistleblowers who had once worked under Sterling. Then, the breakthrough came. A former accountant from Sterling's division provided an encrypted USB drive containing years of concealed transactions, evidence that Sterling had been funneling company funds into a private investment group under a false corporate entity. With everything in place, Ethan called an emergency board meeting. Sterling entered the boardroom with his usual confidence, but the moment he saw the evidence on the screen, his smirk vanished. "Michael," Ethan began, standing at the head of the table, "would you care to explain why company funds have been rerouted into an investment firm under a shell corporation tied to your personal accounts?" Sterling's face paled. "This is absurd. You have no proof." Ethan gestured toward the screen. "We have transaction logs, internal approvals, email correspondences, and a witness willing to testify in court." The board members exchanged shocked glances. The room was silent. Then, Sterling sighed, leaning back in his chair. "All right, Ethan, you've made your point. What do you want?" Ethan's expression was steely. "Your resignation. Effective immediately." Sterling scoffed. "You can't be serious. I built this company, and now you're destroying it." Ethan cut in. "You have two choices: step down quietly, or face a full legal investigation that will ruin your career permanently." Sterling's hands clenched into fists. He scanned the room, looking for support, but no one spoke up. His power was gone. After a long silence, he exhaled sharply. "Fine, you win." Ethan watched as Sterling signed his resignation letter and stormed out of the room. The company had rid itself of its final piece of corruption. As the door closed behind Sterling, Ethan turned to the rest of the board. "Lexington and Hayes will no longer be a place where greed flourishes. It's time we rebuild this company the right way." The room remained silent for a moment. Then, one by one, the board members nodded in agreement. The corruption was over, but the real work was just beginning. Ethan sat in his office, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. The weight of everything that had happened over the past few weeks settled on his shoulders. Sterling was gone. Hastings had been exposed, and the corrupt power structure that had ruled Lexington and Hayes for years had finally crumbled. But he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The morning after Sterling's resignation, the company was abuzz with speculation. Employees whispered in the hallways, uncertain but hopeful. Some feared further upheaval, while others finally felt a sense of security. Ethan had made his statement loud and clear, but now he had to ensure real, lasting change. The first order of business was restructuring leadership. With Sterling and Hastings out, new leadership had to be chosen carefully. Ethan worked with Samantha Reed and David Morrison to ensure that promotions were based on merit and ethical conduct rather than politics or favoritism. The announcement came at a company-wide meeting. Employees gathered in the large atrium, some standing at the balconies above, waiting anxiously. Ethan stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Lexington and Hayes is changing," he began. "For too long, power has been abused, voices have been silenced, and corruption has dictated the way this company operates. That ends now. Today, we start a new chapter, one built on integrity, respect, and accountability." The crowd was silent, absorbing his words. Then, slowly, a few people began to clap. Within seconds, the room erupted into applause. Ethan nodded, acknowledging their support. "We will be implementing policies that ensure fairness and transparency at every level of this company. We are introducing an anonymous reporting system for misconduct, regular leadership evaluations, and clear pathways for career growth based on performance and values, not politics." He turned to the executives standing behind him. "Effective immediately, Samantha Reed will serve as our new Chief Operating Officer. David Morrison will oversee legal affairs and compliance to ensure we never allow corruption to take root here again." Samantha stepped forward, greeted by another wave of applause. Employees had long respected her, and now, she would have the power to ensure they were treated fairly. Ethan continued, "But leadership alone can't change this company. Change happens when each of us commits to creating a culture of integrity. So I ask you, are you ready to build something better?" The response was overwhelming. Cheers and applause filled the atrium. Ethan felt a rare sense of satisfaction. This was the moment he had worked for. Despite the progress, Ethan knew there would always be those who resisted change. Over the following weeks, he received reports of employees attempting to undermine the new policies, small acts of defiance from those who thrived in the old system. One name stood out: Marcus Caldwell, former right-hand man to Sterling. Marcus had been keeping a low profile since Sterling's resignation, but his name appeared in several complaints from junior employees. He had been intimidating staff, attempting to sow distrust in the new leadership. Ethan didn't waste time. He called Marcus into his office. "Marcus," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair, "I hear you've been having trouble adjusting to our new direction." Marcus smirked. "People don't like change, Ethan. You can't erase years of corporate culture overnight." Ethan studied him for a moment. "You're right, but I can remove those who refuse to adapt." Marcus's smirk faltered. "You wouldn't." Ethan leaned forward. "I already have." He slid a termination letter across the desk. "You're done here." Marcus clenched his jaw, but knew he had no leverage. With one last glare, he grabbed the letter and left without another word. The final piece of the old regime was gone. With the last of the internal resistance removed, Ethan could finally focus on the company's future. Over the next few months, productivity increased, employee morale improved, and for the first time in years, Lexington and Hayes wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. One evening, as Ethan packed up his office for the night, Samantha knocked on his door. "You did it," she said with a smile. "The company is finally what it was meant to be." Ethan chuckled. "We did it, and we're just getting started." He looked out the window one last time before shutting off the lights. Tomorrow was a new day, and for the first time in a long time, Lexington and Hayes was truly his company again.